They rewrote the law to erase me. But I was the one who wrote the first draft, and I never forget a clause. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Evelyn Harrow, and I have written more wills than I can count. Ironclad, airtight, sealed with the kind of legal finesse only a woman married to a judge for 47 years can master. I know the mechanics of power, and I know when it's being stolen. When my husband Charles died, I was given flowers, condolences, and a copy of a will I didn't recognize, one with my name diminished to a footnote and my authority stripped entirely. It was slid across the table like a polite insult, handed over by my son, Grant Harrow, with a well-practiced smile and the eyes of a man who no longer saw his mother, only an obstacle. He underestimated me. They all did. What they forget is that before I was a grieving widow, before I was the woman in the garden wing with trembling hands and elegant pearls, I was the firm's most feared negotiator. I wrote the clauses that swallowed empires whole. I crafted settlements that buried scandals before they ever reached a courtroom. I was never just a partner's wife. I was the mind behind the gavel. And now, they will learn what happens when the woman they sidelined returns to the bench, jury, judge, and executioner. I remember the exact moment I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the funeral, though Grant barely held my gaze during his eulogy. It wasn't the absence of Charles's old friends at the wake, many of whom had suddenly become too busy to travel. And it wasn't the way my daughter Margaret's voice cracked when she hugged me, though hers was the only one that didn't sound rehearsed. No, it was the envelope. The envelope, thick with legal documents and heavy with implication, placed discreetly on my writing desk 2 days after the burial. The seal bore the Harrow and Associates crest. Not embossed in gold like Charles's usual letters. Black ink. Corporate issue. Cold. Inside, a restructured version of Charles's will. My name appeared exactly 3 times. And not once with authority. Not as co-trustee. Not as executor. Not even as primary beneficiary of the Harrow estate. Just Evelyn Harrow, widow of Charles Harrow, granted a small monthly stipend and the exclusive right to inhabit the west wing of the Harrow family home for the duration of her natural life. That was the legal phrasing. What it meant. You may sit quietly. You may water your plants. You may watch from the window while we disassemble everything you helped build. But you will not interfere. I sat still for a long time. Not angry. Not grieving. Calculating. Grant arrived that afternoon with a sympathetic expression and 2 estate lawyers in tow, both young, both trying too hard not to look smug. Mother, he began, gesturing for me to sit, I wanted to walk you through some of the updates Dad and I made over the last few years. Updates. That's what they called theft when it wore cufflinks. I trust your eyes are still sharp, he said, sliding the document across the table. But if you'd like a simplified summary, I'm quite fluent in my own language. Thank you, I interrupted. Grant chuckled as if I'd told a joke. The lawyers shifted in their seats. I opened the will and read it top to bottom without flinching. Every clause. Every footnote. Every carefully disguised omission. They'd done a neat job, but not perfect. No will is perfect, not unless I wrote it. Interesting, I said when I finished. This doesn't match the version I helped draft with your father last November. Grant blinked. Mother, Dad hadn't made any changes in years. The firm handled the last updates. No, I said. You handled the last updates. After he was too sick to attend the meetings himself. Isn't that right? One of the lawyers opened his mouth to interject. I silenced him with a look. The living trust was amended. The Harrow Foundation Oversight Board has been restructured. And my voting rights at the firm have been converted to advisory status, a position not outlined in any of our original governance protocols. I closed the folder. And you've made yourself both executor and sole trustee. Grant's jaw tightened. It's for continuity, Mother. No one questions your legacy. This is just about streamlining. I stood slowly. Do you know what I find most impressive? I asked, walking to the window. That you managed to alter over a dozen clauses without triggering a probate review. You must have had help. Skilled help. A paralegal, perhaps. Someone used to ghostwriting. He said nothing. I turned back to face him. Tell me, Grant, did you forge the notary seal yourself, or did you ask someone from the estate division to do it for you? The lawyers froze. He tried to smile. You have no proof. No, I said. But I have time. And I have memory. And most importantly, I still know how to draw blood in the margins. After they left, I opened the safe Charles once kept behind the framed portrait of his grandfather. Inside, just as I suspected, was the original draft of his will, dated 8 months before his death. It bore our dual signatures. Co-trustees. Equal control. A sunset clause if either party was incapacitated or manipulated. It had never been revoked. It had simply disappeared from the file room. Grant was smart, but I taught him, and I never teach everything. That night, I returned to my writing desk. Not to grieve. To begin the ledger. Not of Charles's final days, but of everything that came next. Because if they wanted a legal war, they were going to get one. And this time, the verdict wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would come from me. The west wing of the Harrow estate had once been mine. Not figuratively. Not sentimentally. It was where I had built the foundation of both my marriage and the firm. The second-floor library with its mahogany panels and deep green armchairs was where Charles and I drafted our first client charter. The adjoining solarium, always too warm in the afternoons, was where I read depositions while my children napped. Now, the same wing had been rebranded the retreat quarters. In the revised estate documentation, it was described as a peaceful private annex of the family home, suitable for dignified aging. That phrase stuck with me, dignified aging. As if dignity were something someone else could assign to you. Like a title. Or take away. 2 days after the meeting with Grant, I returned to the wing. Everything had changed. My desk was gone. Replaced with a minimalist console table topped with a sculptural glass bowl, empty, decorative, and deeply useless. The portrait of my late mother-in-law was no longer above the fireplace. In its place was a colorless abstract canvas that looked like a corporate screensaver. My law books were boxed. My reading chair, high-backed, worn, reliable, was nowhere in sight. The kitchen staff had left a tray on the sideboard, bland porridge, sliced melon, herbal tea. A note beneath it, in Claudia's looping hand. Just a little something light for your morning. Keep your strength up. Hugs and kisses, C. I stared at the note for a full minute before tearing it in two. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled up the floorboard in the northwest corner of the solarium. Charles never knew about the compartment I carved into the baseboard. It wasn't out of mistrust. It was habit. A woman in a room full of men learns early to make space for herself that no one else can enter. Inside was a small cedar box, wrapped in linen and tied with twine. And within that box, untouched since the day I retired, was a brass key. Old, heavy, ornate, insignificant to anyone else. But I knew where it fit. I waited until dusk, when the house grew quiet. Claudia had taken the household staff out for a team-building dinner, a new tradition Shed invented after she started referring to the butler and head cook as lifestyle managers. I crossed the main corridor in silence, padding barefoot across the carpet I'd chosen with Charles in 1981, a deep wine red, to dampen the echo of rushed footsteps during late-night arguments. The door at the end of the hall led to the east study. Grant thought it had been sealed when the archive room was digitized and the legal library moved to cloud storage. He was wrong. The key still fit. Dust floated like old ghosts as I stepped inside. The room was untouched. The shelves still bore the labels I had placed there decades ago: founding documents, client agreements, charitable trusts. In the center of the room stood the antique partner's desk, oak, wide and weathered. And in the corner, the Harrow filing safe. Combination lock. Manual. Immune to digital tampering. I sat at the desk and pulled open the top drawer. Inside, wrapped in yellowing parchment and tied with string, was what I'd hoped for: the founding charter of Harrow and Associates. Signed in 1969 by Charles, myself, and Arthur Linley, our first partner, long since passed. A thin stack of amendments followed, each one noting changes in corporate structure, family inheritance rights, and oversight governance. And there, between the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, was the clause I suspected had been scrubbed from the current firm handbook in the event of a breach of ethical duty by a lead partner. Any surviving co-founder may motion to dissolve or restructure the board in accordance with fiduciary rebalancing, regardless of current voting shares. My fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. They had erased my name from the practice, but they had never erased my right. Back in my quarters, I photocopied the documents page by page, careful to preserve the aging ink and seal impressions. I uploaded them onto a private drive and secured them with the kind of encryption that required not one, but 3 passwords, each based on dates only I remembered. Then I placed the originals in a fireproof lockbox under the floorboards once again. Only this time, I placed something else beside them, a small voice recorder. And on it, I left a message. To the one who finds this, if you're listening, then they've made their final move. And I have made mine. The firm does not belong to them. The house does not belong to them. My silence does not belong to them. The gavel comes home to rest in the hands of the woman who first carved it from wood. My name is Evelyn Harrow, and I am not gone. As I lay in bed that night, the storm rolled in from the south, the kind that rattled windows and peeled away old paint from corners of the house long untouched. Fitting, I thought. The rain had always come before a cleansing. And this house? It was long overdue. In the early days of the firm, before the name Harrow carried any weight outside of courtroom doors and sealed arbitration chambers, Charles and I used to keep our case files in wooden cabinets labeled by hand. No cloud backups. No virtual dockets. Just paper, ink, and memory. Memory, I learned, is the most powerful archive. And mine? Impeccable. The morning after I rediscovered the founding charter, I called an old contact under the guise of sending flowers. Rosemary Chin, former estate liaison. Retired, or so the firm told everyone. In reality, she was quietly paid off after errors surfaced in several asset consolidation cases. I never believed she was the one at fault. She picked up on the second ring. "Evelyn," she said, voice calm as ever. "I wondered when you'd call." "I need access," I said. "The Claremont files. From 2016. A pause. "You know those were sealed under corporate reclassification." "Yes," I replied, "but they shouldn't have been." Charles had doubts. And I remember what was missing. She gave a small, tired sigh. "I'll send you what I have. But be careful. You're chasing something they're willing to bury people over." "I'm not chasing," I said. "I'm unearthing." When the files arrived, discreetly, via a private courier service I'd once helped Charles establish, I read them in full at the partner's desk in the East Study. And there it was. Client: Marion Claremont. Date of death: July 3, 2016. Estate value: $8 per million. Executor: Harrow and Associates, via Grant Harrow. Disposition: family trust terminated. Assets redirected. Redirected? I remembered Marion. She was a former judge. No children. No close family. She had a dog named Bishop and a passion for supporting educational grants. Her original will, drawn up by me, I might add, designated the funds to establish a girls' scholarship endowment at Middleton Law College. But here, in the updated record, the endowment was missing. In its place? A discretionary payout to an entity named Montclair Trust Holdings. A name I'd never seen until I cross-referenced it with the Harrow Estates investment ledger. That's when the dominoes began to fall. Montclair Trust Holdings didn't exist until 6 months after Marion's death. registered offshore, listed under a different managing firm. But its first deposit? Exactly $8 per million. The amount of Marion's entire estate. And the signature on the disbursement? Grant E. Harrow. Dated 2 weeks after the firm claimed the case was fully resolved. This wasn't a clerical error. This was theft. Of the worst kind. Not from the living, but from the dead. And not by strangers, but by family, the kind that used their legacy as a crowbar to pry open locked doors, then smiled while they emptied the vaults. I sat back, nausea rising, hands shaking not from age, but rage. This wasn't an isolated case. If Grant had altered one will, he'd altered others. And not just small estates, charitable ones. Foundations. Trusts with silent benefactors and no one to question the fine print. But someone had questioned it. Charles. I remembered the night 7 months before he died, when he brought me tea and stood awkwardly in the doorway of my room. I think there's something wrong in the Claremont files, he said. They don't match the original codicils. I told him to look deeper. He said he would. And then, he stopped mentioning it. Back in the archive room, I found the original Claremont will, tucked into a folder labeled Archival, Non-Actionable. The signature page had been replaced. I pulled out my magnifier. Charles's name was still there. But mine wasn't. Grant had removed it. Because in the original draft, I had signed off as co-executor. And under that designation, nothing could have been moved without my explicit consent. He knew that. And he'd buried me along with the evidence. I returned to the West Wing, printed every page, and placed them into a separate binder marked simply, Ghost Cases. It was the first of many. I already knew what came next. A reckoning. And once the ghosts start speaking, no amount of new paint or polite smiles can muffle their voices. They thought they were clever, staging it as a game. The Harrow and Associates quarterly leadership simulation exercise was one of Grant's favorite innovations. A tradition built on performative inclusion, designed to make the junior partners feel like they mattered. They called it the mock trial. A mock case. A fake conflict. Neutral judges. Points for rhetoric. Prizes for team synergy. It was a hollow production until they made one critical mistake. This year's trial was about me. The scenario was absurdly transparent. A high-profile matriarchal client, codenamed Client E, was accused of interfering with trust operations following the death of her husband. The case revolved around whether she had breached fiduciary protocols by questioning the updated terms of the will, which had been drafted under legitimate last-minute circumstances. They may as well have called the client Evelyn and handed me a script. The younger attorneys, eager and oblivious, debated the ethics of E's actions, unaware the woman sitting at the far end of the boardroom, sipping tea with a neutral expression, was the very subject of their rhetorical autopsy. I could feel Grant watching me from across the room. This was his way of warning me. This was his way of saying, "Stay in your lane, mother." When the moderator asked if I had any questions for the panel, I stood with slow, deliberate grace and walked to the front. Every eye turned toward me. "I'd like to offer a counterargument," I said. One not from the perspective of prosecution or defense, but from the foundation of law itself. Grant leaned forward, suddenly interested. He didn't expect me to engage. He expected me to retreat. I didn't. "I want you to imagine," I began, "that the client in this hypothetical scenario isn't just someone's mother. She's not just a widow. She's the co-founder of the legal entity in question. She was present at its inception. She wrote the original charter. She trained half the people in this room." I paused. "And now she's being tried in absentia by the very legacy she created." A hush fell. "She is accused of interference, but the documents, many of which are conveniently no longer on file, show her as co-executor, as fiduciary, as the first to sign the trust amendments. And yet," I turned slowly to face Grant, "the only thing she's guilty of is surviving." There was a beat of silence. And then, polite clapping. Nervous, hesitant. A few of the younger associates nodded, unsure whether to cheer or check with their mentors first. Grant said nothing, but his eyes, those cold, glassy things, flashed with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Fear. After the session, he approached me in the hallway, alone. "You made your point," he said through clenched teeth. "I wasn't trying to," I replied. "I was simply correcting a factual inaccuracy." He stepped closer. "You don't know what you're doing, don't I?" His jaw twitched. "This firm is not your war zone." "No," I said, leaning in just slightly. "It's my graveyard. And I've just started reading the tombstones." That night, Vanessa joined me in the archive room. We sat together, side by side, scrolling through file after file, each more damning than the last. She found another discrepancy, a trust intended for refugee relief that had somehow ended up funding a luxury real estate development in Valencia. A trail of paperwork leading directly to a dummy company registered in her uncle's name. "They're laundering legacy," she whispered. I nodded. "And they're about to be audited by the one woman who remembers every number that was ever meant to count." Back in the West Wing, I opened a new folder. This one I labeled in thick, black ink, "Trial Notes, Real." Because the mock trial was over. And now, the real one had begun. Vanessa arrived at the estate just before noon on a Tuesday, dressed in a dark blazer 2 sizes too large, and carrying a leather satchel that had seen better days. She had her father's sharp jawline, but none of his polish. Her hair was pulled into a haphazard knot, and the first thing she said to me wasn't hello, it was, "I don't think I want to be a Harrow anymore." I poured her tea and said nothing. Some truths are too heavy to respond to right away. She hadn't been to the estate in over a year. Claudia claimed Vanessa was taking time to find herself, which I now saw was code for "we've cut her off until she learns her place." Instead, Vanessa had been living with a friend, studying contract law part-time at a community program, and working under a pseudonym as a legal assistant for a nonprofit that handled housing rights litigation. That detail made me smile. The Harrow legacy she was running from still ran through her veins. "You're not surprised," she said. "Not about you," I replied. "You were always the one with the questions. You just needed a reason to start asking them." She pulled out her satchel and slid a folder across the table. It was thick, carefully tabbed, dog-eared, and damning. She'd begun gathering records months ago, after stumbling across an inconsistency in the documentation of the Harper Winters Trust, a mid-sized estate the firm had handled years prior. The original will stated that the estate's remainder was to be split evenly between 3 environmental charities. But according to Vanessa's notes, only one charity had received funds. The other 2? Replaced in the revised documents with entities Vanessa traced back to shell accounts in the firm's offshore holdings. And who signed off on the revision? Her father, Grant. And the most interesting part, she added, flipping to a final page. The notarization. It's a digital signature tied to Claudia's laptop. I raised an eyebrow. She notarized her husband's documents? On a Sunday. From the beach house. While they were offline. I smiled. Sloppy. We spent the next 5 hours combing through more files together, my paper ledgers, her digital charts. Names began to repeat. Patterns emerged. The same corporate names bounced through different trusts. The same lawyer initials appeared again and again, always on the revision pages. Always in ink that didn't quite match the rest of the document. At one point, Vanessa sat back and stared at the ceiling. "It's all of front. The entire firm." "It didn't used to be," I said softly. She looked at me. "Did you know this was happening?" I suspected. But Charles died before he could confirm it. And then I was invited to step back. "Did they really think you wouldn't fight?" "No," I said. "They counted on me being tired." Vanessa's voice dropped. "Are you?" I met her gaze. "Not anymore." The following morning, I took her to the East Study. Her breath caught at the sight of the old books, the dust-covered ledgers, the oak desk. "It's like a time capsule." "No," I said. "It's a crime scene." I opened a drawer and pulled out a smaller ledger. "This was your grandfather's." The last one he kept before he got too sick to finish them. Inside were half-filled entries. Unfinished names. One transaction with a single note beside it, V.H., to confirm. Vanessa Harrow. He meant her. Later that evening, we sat on the balcony, watching the last sliver of sun bleed into the horizon. She turned to me and said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "We're going to do what Harrows were always supposed to do, uphold the law. Even if we have to burn the firm down to do it." The Bible was exactly where I left it, third shelf from the top, wrapped in a lace cloth inside the glass cabinet in the study, beneath a brass clock that hadn't ticked since Charles's first heart attack. We hadn't been particularly devout, Charles and I. Church on holidays, donations to the right causes, a priest at the funeral, but the Bible itself? That was personal. A gift from his grandmother, bound in cracked navy leather, its edges gilded and curling like brittle leaves. He never read it, not really. But he kept it close, always on display. A symbol of legacy, like everything else in this house. But I knew Charles too well. And symbols were never just symbols to him. I opened the cover slowly. There, between the pages of Exodus and Leviticus, was something solid. Heavy. A long, flat key, unlike any I'd seen in the house. But I knew the shape. It was old. Pre-war. Not for any ordinary room. This was for the estate strongbox. The strongbox had been built into the paneling of the fireplace in Charles's private study, now locked behind a biometric panel Grant had installed to keep the archives secure. A system only he and Claudia had access to, or so they thought. They didn't know I still had the building plans. And I remembered the contractor who had helped install that system, Robert Givens. A man who once owed me a favor after I kept his construction company from being sued into dust by a client with a grudge. I called Robert that afternoon. By evening, I had the bypass code. Vanessa and I waited until the estate was empty. Grant and Claudia had gone to a charity gala in the city, still clinging to appearances. They'd left the junior staff in charge. No one noticed two shadows move through the hallway, quiet as smoke. We entered the study and closed the door behind us. The scanner blinked red until I entered the override. The safe panel clicked open. And there it was. The strongbox. Its surface was dusty, untouched. I slid the key into the lock. Turned. It opened with a sigh. Inside were three things: a velvet pouch containing a memory card, a folded letter addressed to me, a thin leather-bound binder, hand-labeled in Charles's script, for the Harrow who remembers. I sat down and opened the letter first. Evelyn, if you're reading this, I wasn't brave enough to finish what I started. I knew they were changing things, using the firm to funnel money, rewrite legacies, erase intentions. I saw it in the Claremont revisions, in the way Grant talked about control. I should have stopped them, but I was tired. And I thought maybe they'd stop once I was gone. But you and I both know Harrows don't stop, not unless someone makes them. This binder contains copies of everything I found. The memory card, audio, recordings I made of meetings I wasn't supposed to hear. I never knew how to use it, but you will. And if you need help, find Vanessa. She's more like you than she knows. Forgive me for leaving this to you. See, my hands trembled. Not from weakness, from rage. Because he had known, and he'd left the breadcrumbs behind, hoping I'd come after him. And I had. Vanessa took the binder and began scanning the documents, dozens of scanned revisions, emails, transcribed conversations. At the back was a sheet of names. 5 clients. All elderly. All deceased. All had wills that were altered posthumously. And all were tied to a single offshore holding company, Salver Oak Limited. She looked at me. This is criminal. Yes, I said. But more than that, it's personal. Because these weren't just clients. These were people who had trusted us. Who had trusted me. And their final wishes had been sold off for cash and campaign favors. We uploaded the files. Backed up everything. Multiple times. Then I placed the letter back in the box, locked it, and returned it to its hiding place. Not because I was done with it, but because I wasn't ready for the world to see it yet. Later that night, Vanessa asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What do we do now?" And I said, "Now we put them on trial." She smiled grimly. Mock or real? I looked out the window at the house, our house, sleeping under stolen light. Oh, it'll be real. And the verdict will be mine. The codicil was buried deep. Not in a drawer. Not in a vault. Not even in a safe. It was tucked inside the firm's internal legislative archive, a database so old, even Grant had forgotten it existed. It hadn't been updated in years. Most of the associates didn't even know how to log in. But I did. I designed the original framework myself. They'd called it the Iron Index, a nickname given by Charles during a late-night bottle of sherry and a debate over who'd had more revisions approved in committee. It was where we kept legacy documents, clause history, arbitration notes, anything too sensitive or too dangerous to live in the cloud. And there, filed under addenda, Precedent Trust Protections, 1981, was the clause that would become my sword. Codicil 6. 13. Survivorship override in the event of fiduciary breach in any case where a direct heir is found to have violated ethical, legal, or fiduciary protocols in their capacity as a trustee, executor, or executor in fact. Control of trust-related assets may be returned to the surviving co-founder of the Harrow legal entity for the purpose of temporary oversight, correction of damage, and re-establishment of integrity. This override may supersede board majority if supported by evidence admissible in internal arbitration. I read it twice, 3 times, then printed a hard copy and sealed it in an envelope. That codicil wasn't just a weapon. It was authority. I could take the firm back without needing a courtroom, a judge, or even a public trial. If I brought this before the Harrow Foundation's arbitration board and proved Grant's breach, I could strip him of everything. Control, title, reputation. And Claudia? She would fall with him. Vanessa sat across from me in the East study, eyes wide as I finished reading the clause aloud. "They let this stay on file," she whispered. "They didn't know it was here," I said. "They scrubbed the visible archives. They forgot the old ones." She leaned in. This is a trapdoor." "Yes," I said. "And I built it years ago for this very reason." "You knew this might happen?" "No," I replied softly. "I knew power corrupts. I just never imagined it would be my own son." We began preparations that night. There was no time to waste. The arbitration board only met once per quarter, and the next session was 2 weeks away. We needed airtight evidence, verified timelines, signed memos, email chains, witnesses, motive. Vanessa handled the digital trail. I worked on the historical proof. Between us, we built a file that would not only activate the codicil, but force the firm into internal investigation. I even included the memory card Charles left behind. Its audio recordings were clear, if grainy. One in particular stood out, Grant's voice, cold and clipped. "If Mother pushes this, we'll have to isolate her. We can't risk her name being tied to these revisions. Reframe it as grief. Get Claudia to write something for the press. Something soft." That alone was enough to detonate a reputation. By the end of the week, we had everything we needed. I addressed the envelope to the arbitration chair, Meredith Crane, one of Charles's oldest legal peers and the last person on the board I trusted. Inside, I included the codicil, the proof, and a short handwritten note. "Meredith, I taught the law to my children. Now I must remind them what it means. Initiate override." Evelyn Harrow, when I handed the envelope to the courier, my hands were steady. Not shaking, not uncertain. Steady. That night, I opened the French doors of the West Wing and stood under the stars. Vanessa joined me, barefoot, holding 2 glasses of wine. "To consequences," she said. I raised my glass. "No," I whispered. "To clarity." Because the codicil wasn't vengeance. It was restoration. And this time, the law wasn't in their hands. It was in mine. The financials arrived just after sunrise. A flash drive, wrapped in a blank invoice, delivered by a courier who didn't wait for a signature. No note. No sender. But I knew who it was from. Rosemary. There were still people in this world who remembered what Harrow and Associates stood for before it became a machine for laundering ambition. People who remembered when law meant limits, not just leverage. Vanessa plugged the drive into the encrypted terminal in my study, her eyes scanning fast as the screen filled with PDFs, spreadsheets, and internal memos. It didn't take long to find it. At the bottom of a quarterly fund report, buried in a footnote, hidden behind 3 unrelated appendices, was a name we hadn't seen before: LD00-17, Reserve Allocation, Underbelly Discretionary Fund. Vanessa clicked. Her breath caught. There were more than 20 transfers listed. Amounts ranged from $18,000 to over $500,000, spread across 6 years. The recipients? Not clients. Not legal vendors. Not court retainer fees. They were private shell entities. Film production companies with no IMDb entries. Non-existent foundations. Political advisory groups located in P.O. boxes across Eastern Europe and the Bahamas. And one company in particular caught our attention: Selwick Vantage Limited. It appeared 12 times. Always large sums. Always marked as legacy development support. But when we dug deeper, we discovered Selwick wasn't a real business. It was a holding company, registered under a former alias used by Grant in his university years, G. Elson Vant, a name he used in law school to publish anonymous opinion essays and early business ideas. We cross-referenced the alias with tax forms, and there it was. Grant had used Selwick to move over $2 million from the Harrow Foundation's reserved client funds. Money that was never his. Money meant for scholarships, settlements, public service. Gone. Vanessa slammed her laptop shut, her jaw clenched. I don't understand how no one saw this. Because people like your father don't make mistakes, I said. They make distractions. The next step was connecting the shell accounts to the firm's reputation laundering. That's when we found Claudia's part. She'd been funneling the money through Harrow's PR subcontractors, labeling them as image elevation efforts and legacy rebranding campaigns. In plain terms, she was paying influencers and journalists to revise Harrow's history, bribing reporters to delete old articles about lawsuits, paying for think pieces on modern legal dynasties, even a lifestyle segment where she was listed as one of America's quietest power wives. Vanessa pulled up a headline: Claudia Harrow, the elegant matriarch behind a legal empire. And below it, a photo of her on the estate's balcony, the same balcony where I had once stood holding my newborn grandson, shielding him from the cold. It was like looking at a stolen reflection. We printed everything, a binder 3 inches thick. At the front, we inserted a single page. Just one: Misappropriated Funds Log, 2016 to 2024. Compiled by E. Harrow and V. Harrow. Verified against Trust Codicil 6. 13. The underbelly wasn't just exposed. It was mapped. And it was about to become public record. That night, I returned to Charles's fireplace, where the old brass crest still hung above the mantel. I touched the engraved motto with a finger: Fiat Veritas. Let truth be done. And I whispered to the room, let it be done now. It wasn't supposed to be public. The arbitration board had always handled family disputes with discretion, whispers behind mahogany doors, votes passed by signature slips, reputations cleaned before anyone noticed the stain. But this time, I refused the closed session. This time, I invoked the codicil on record. And once the media caught wind of it, thanks to a carefully worded tip to a former legal correspondent who owed me a favor, the story spread fast. Widow of Harrow legal empire challenges son over alleged misuse of client trusts. Retired matriarch of Harrow and Associates files for legal override based on founders' clause. The firm scrambled. Grant tried to issue a statement. Claudia went silent, and the board called for an emergency deposition. The Harrow Foundation's grand chamber hadn't been used in years. The last time I sat beneath its arched ceiling was at Charles's retirement banquet. Now, the banners were stripped, the silver polished, and the chairs arranged in neat rows for what was no longer an internal hearing, but a reckoning. Vanessa walked beside me, carrying our file. When we entered, all conversation stopped. Eyes followed us as if we were royalty returned from exile. Or executioners. At the head of the room sat Meredith Crane, the arbitration chair, flanked by 4 other board members, none of whom had ever voted against Grant before. To her left, Grant stood in a charcoal suit. Thinner, paler, angry. To her right, Claudia. Perfect, poised, and glaring at me like I'd ruined a dinner party. I took my seat. Vanessa sat behind me. Meredith raised her gavel. We are gathered under Article 9 of the Foundation Charter. This is an evidentiary deposition. The Harrow matriarch has filed for fiduciary override. All statements will be entered into formal record. And, just like that, the floodgates opened. I began by introducing the codicil. Meredith accepted it into evidence. The others murmured, flipping through the pages. None of them had seen it before. Then came the binder. One by one, Vanessa and I presented the records: misappropriated client trust funds, altered wills, shell companies, underbelly discretionary accounts, paid PR narratives, audio recordings of Grant's own voice discussing my isolation. Each document was time-stamped, verified, cross-referenced. It wasn't just compelling. It was damning. Grant rose, trying to object. These documents are taken out of context. My mother has a personal vendetta. She's grieving. I stood. No, I said, voice firm. I grieved already. You stole during my silence. You forged during my grief. And now I speak. The chamber went still. You forged the future, Grant. I continued. And you thought no one would remember the past. But I do. I always have. Then I turned to Claudia. You let him launder the dead. Paid people to rewrite who we were. Used your influence to erase me while wearing my name. She didn't respond. But her eyes, those carefully composed eyes, blinked too fast. Vanessa approached the dais and handed one final document to Meredith. A signed affidavit from a former paralegal. Grant's paralegal. Sworn testimony that he had backdated legal revisions under instruction. Final nail. The room buzzed. Meredith raised her gavel again. We will deliberate immediately. 15 minutes passed in heavy silence. When the board returned, Meredith didn't sit. She didn't need to. Grant Harrow is hereby suspended from all leadership roles effective immediately. Claudia Harrow is removed from all executive affiliations with the Foundation. Oversight control of the Harrow Trust and Estate shall be temporarily reassigned to Evelyn Harrow, founding partner and surviving co-executor. The gavel fell, and with it, the dynasty cracked. Grant didn't speak. Claudia turned on her heel and walked out. Vanessa exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. I stood there, spine straight, and let the silence embrace me. Not as a threat, but as peace. That evening, back at the estate, I poured a glass of Charles's favorite bourbon and stood by the fire. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt restored. Behind me, Vanessa said, "What now?" And I said, "Now we rebuild it. And this time, we do it right." 2 days after the deposition, the formal arbitration began. This was no longer about exposure. This was procedure, process, precision. And it was mine. For years, I had trained junior partners to fear arbitration, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. Nothing in the law moves faster than silence in a room full of people realizing they've lost control. This time, that silence belonged to Grant. The arbitration was held in the Harrow and Associates executive suite, a space once filled with my husband's voice, now reclaimed by mine. The air was cold and overly conditioned. The chairs had been replaced in the past year, sleeker, more contemporary. They felt like thrones for people who forgot they'd have to sit in them someday. Vanessa sat at my left, Meredith Crane at the center. Across the table, Grant. Alone. No legal counsel this time. His own firm refused to represent him. Claudia was absent. A quiet resignation letter submitted via courier. No apology. Just a signature. Fitting. Meredith called the arbitration to order. Her voice, always a blade, cut through the room. We are convened under Clause 6(13) to determine final reassignment of fiduciary leadership. Then she looked at me. Mrs. Harrow, you may proceed. I rose. No notes. No documents. Only my memory. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, I will not waste your time repeating what has already been proven. You have seen the accounts. You have heard the tapes. You have reviewed the affidavits. I turned slightly toward Grant. What we are deciding now is not whether there was misconduct. That is established. What we are deciding is whether the house my husband and I built brick by brick, clause by clause, should continue under the hands of the man who disassembled it. Grant flinched. Good. I continued. Harrow and Associates was founded on 3 things: trust, clarity, and honor. Not perfection. Not greed. Not political leverage. But the idea that the law is not a shield for the powerful. It is a weight. And you either carry it with dignity, or you do not carry it at all. I looked directly at Meredith. My son dropped it, and crushed the very people we swore to serve. She nodded, then turned to Grant. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. Not a defense. Not an excuse. Because what defense can you mount against a mother with every receipt? The board deliberated for less than 10 minutes. When they returned, Meredith cleared her throat. By unanimous vote, we assign full fiduciary control and interim leadership of Harrow and Associates to Evelyn Harrow. A pause. You are further granted authority to audit, restructure, and reform the firm as you see fit. Your term is indefinite until new appointments are proposed and confirmed by board vote. I exhaled. Not relief. Resolution. Afterward, the others cleared the room. Grant remained seated, staring at the table. I approached him slowly. You know, I said you could have had it all. You just didn't want to share it. He didn't look up. Everything I did for the family. No, I said gently. You did it for yourself. And the family paid for it. He finally met my gaze. For a moment, I saw the boy I raised, the one who used to sit on this floor, stacking legal volumes like building blocks. The one who asked, "How do you know when something's fair?" I almost pitied him. Almost. That night, I walked through the estate's main hall, alone. The portraits were back. The family crest rehung above the fireplace. And the old motto etched into stone glowed gold in the firelight, Fiat Veritas. Let truth be done. I smiled softly. It has. The Harrow estate was uncharacteristically quiet in the days after the arbitration. No reporters. No phone calls. No new statements from the firm. Just the hollow sound of legacy being scrubbed clean, an empire torn down brick by brick and rebuilt with steadier hands. And in that silence, someone knocked. Not at the main gate. Not through an assistant or lawyer or courier. At my private garden door. Margaret. My daughter. She looked tired, coat unbuttoned, curls tousled, her lipstick worn and smudged around the corners. But her expression was clear. This wasn't a social visit. This was something else. May I come in? She asked. I opened the door wider without a word. She entered like someone returning to a chapel after losing faith. We sat in the west parlor, my room, my rules. No staff, no surveillance, no polite distractions. Margaret's eyes moved across the shelves, the flowers, the old photographs that still remained. One in particular of her, Charles and me, laughing in front of the courthouse on the day of her bar admission. She reached for it, then paused. "I kept quiet too long," she said finally. "I know," I replied. She blinked. "You don't want an apology?" "I do. But I'd rather have the reason." She closed her eyes. "When Charles got sick, Grant came to me. Said you were slipping. That you were losing track of the numbers. He said he needed help, just until the transition was smooth. Just until Dad passed." I said nothing. She kept going. "He made it sound reasonable. Like you were fragile." And I wanted to believe that. Because it was easier than confronting what I was seeing. "What were you seeing?" Margaret's voice dropped. "How easy it was to push you out." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She was always Charles's daughter in that way, able to hold grief in a clenched jaw. "He told me you'd signed everything. That you were tired. That you wanted a quiet life." "I signed nothing," I said. "I know that now." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents. "They wanted me to draft a secondary codicil, something to revoke your oversight of the Harrow Scholarship Fund." I refused. That's when they iced me out. Gradually. Meetings without notice. Projects reassigned. The title stayed, but the power didn't. "And you let it happen." She flinched. "Yes." I stood and poured 2 cups of tea. My hand was steady. More than I could say for hers. When I returned, she took the cup with shaking fingers. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she said. "No," I said softly. "But neither did you deserve to carry silence alone." She looked up at me, confused. "You knew." "I knew you weren't cruel. Just complicit. There's a difference. Cruelty enjoys the harm. Complicity just closes the curtains." We sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked, "Is it too late to help?" "No," I said, "because you still remember how this house was built." Later that night, I added her name to the audit list, not as a subject, but as a participant. Together, we began to track the side accounts Claudia left behind. Fraud doesn't end when the gavel falls. It slithers, it divides, it resurfaces in different forms. But this time we were watching. Margaret handled the offshore firms. Vanessa built the digital compliance program. And me? I stood at the helm again. Not with vengeance. With vigilance. They thought blood would blind us. But they forgot something important. Blood remembers too. There was no ribbon cutting. No press conference. No champagne flutes raised under golden chandeliers. Just the quiet creak of the Harrow Foundation's front doors swinging open, this time to the community, not to cameras. The building had changed. Not in marble or trim, but in feeling. There were new voices now. Laughter down the halls. Students in the conference rooms. Law interns pacing nervously with files in hand. Not expense reports, but pro bono cases, real work, meant for real people. And at the head of it all? Vanessa. She took to the leadership role with the kind of grace you don't teach in law school. Measured, clear, and unafraid to say, "I don't know, but I will find out." She restructured the firm's junior program, reinstated the public scholarship fund, and created the Harrow Justice Initiative, a branch dedicated to reviewing estate mismanagement and elder abuse claims. The first case they won was for a widow whose will had been quietly rewritten by her son. Vanessa won it in 5 days. Margaret returned as senior counsel for the Foundation's Ethics Committee. She doesn't sit at the head of any table by choice. But every major document passes through her hands. And the West Wing? Mine again. But now I keep the doors open. The library is filled with interns. The tea kettle never stops whistling. And I teach a course once a week, Foundations of Legacy Law, where I open every session with the same line: power isn't in what you inherit. It's in what you protect. Some days, I walk through the house alone. I visit Charles's study, now a mentorship room. I water the orchids that once wilted from neglect. I sit beneath the oak tree outside the garden doors, the one Charles planted on our 25th anniversary, with roots now deeper than even the firm's. And I listen. Not for ghosts. For quiet. Because quiet no longer means exile. It means peace. One evening, Vanessa joined me on the garden bench. She had a manila folder in hand and a smile that didn't need explanation. "What's that?" I asked. "The final audit." I opened it. "Read it." Not a single discrepancy. Not one. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "We did it." I closed the folder. "No," I said. "You did." Before we went back inside, I returned to the old rose bush by the north gate, the one Charles had trimmed with the same care he gave to his cross-examinations. I knelt beside it, dug softly into the dirt, and buried something small, a sealed envelope, labeled in my handwriting. To the Harrow who forgets. Legacy is not about what you leave behind. It's about what you fight to keep. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I turned to Vanessa. "Tomorrow," I said, "let's talk succession." She laughed. "Isn't this your succession?" I smiled. "No, darling. This was my return.